thanks for everyone for coming. It is like the day before a major U.S. holiday, so it's not too surprising that not many people are here. But good to see all of you. I'll start with the normal highlights. So Java, I see a lot of stuff going on for delete performance. So can you go back to the, thanks, just leave it there. Lots of good stuff going on for delete performance. Anton has been taking a close look at this area. I also know that R. Bala Mohan, he doesn't have a name other than that, but I want to say thank you. He did the initial PR to parallelize delete file reading. And when you carried that one across the finish line, so good to have that in. I think that is also getting updated by Anton's later work because Anton has a even more fancy cache. Admit. So we are seeing like lots of good improvements for delete files, and I think that's going to be a really nice addition to the 1.5 release. Also, I want to say thanks to Peter, who added the ability to filter column stats after planning time. So what this does is you can still use all of the stats. We'll read them from the data files as we're going, but when you pass those data files back through the API, we don't actually need to keep all of them around. So it's actually quite nice to be able to avoid deserializing and keeping all of those stats in memory. And I suspect that we'll want to push that even further if we can, just avoiding even materializing or deserializing some of those stats into even byte maps, because there's just no need to even add them. We'll have to add some updates to the map reader in Avro for that, but I can imagine like this is going to be a nice performance improvement, especially when tables have lots of columns and you haven't tuned the statistics and metadata for them. So that one's really great to get in. Also, 8717 from Carapaya is added like 10 or 12 metrics to Spark, which is actually a really nice addition. So good to see a lot more metrics from our planning phase get into the Spark API. That's going to be super useful. So thanks there. Also want to highlight updates happening on the Python and Rust side. So Rust has added the scaffolding for the REST catalog, and load table has been added. Thank you to Renji for working on those. I think we're also, there are multiple people. I know Tabular, AWS, and Apple are all interested in adding a plan files route to the REST catalog. So we may be able to get much faster support by having REST catalog support in some of these other languages, basically so you can delegate to the catalog for job planning. So that would be a major improvement, and we're looking forward to getting REST catalog support in Rust. Next, and not least, I want to talk about table metadata updates. The Python side has been rolling along with Faco, who can't be here today, but he's reviewing like crazy. So great to see that table metadata updates are in flight. I think one of the earliest use cases for Python is just being able to do things like update the current schema, which you can do already, update properties, which you can do already, and then go take a look at some of these other metadata updates that we're adding. So really great to see those going in. Great to see a lot of this work. So thank you to everyone who's been contributing. Next, I want to talk about the 1.4.3 release. There are, I think, two major issues that we're tracking. Well, definitely one major issue that we're tracking, and I'm curious to learn more about the Avro system property, because that doesn't appear to be an actual fix to any problem. So I'm surprised that it's a CVE, and I'm also surprised that it is considered a mitigation to the CVE. So JB, do you want to take it away and talk more about the CVE and specifically why you think it's worth doing a patch release in Iceberg?
Yeah, I think that actually I have to double check because I share your point. When I start to review the CV, so basically what I check the Avro release, and when I check what the impact on Iceberg, I don't think we are impacted directly, in my opinion. So I think it's good to have just to avoid, like some kind of security scanner that say, hey, you are still using the old Avro version. But I don't think we are in the rush to do this release. I double checked yesterday. I will do it again tonight, just to be sure that we don't have impact. But in my opinion, we don't have any impact in Iceberg. It's what I saw. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if you have another thought about that, but not sure if it makes sense to have a patch release with this Avro update
Yeah,
specifically.
yeah, I agree with that. It's good to hear you question it as well. So for context, for anyone who hasn't taken a look at the CVE basically says if you have corrupt data in an Avro file, you can have Avro allocate large buffers, right? Like, which makes sense. If you have, say, a binary type, it is length prefixed binary, or a string is also length prefixed UTF-8. And the CVE is about an out of memory error, which I guess is an attack vector for a denial of service, but it is also kind of silly. Now, the mitigation is not actually a mitigation. What the mitigation is there were system properties that controlled the max length of strings um, so that you could control this already. So you could say, hey, strings read by Avro, I never want them to allocate more than 5K or something like that in order to work around this. Now, the problem is that that's still a failure. So
Yeah,
instead of running out of memory, you get this like, hey, this is this string length is too long, so you can't do anything. Now that doesn't take down the application, granted, but it's still a failure. The other thing is that this PR doesn't actually introduce new checks. It just sort of moves around the checks that already exist. So the properties already exist, the checks already exist, and it just consolidates them into one single class. So I'm not convinced that this is, a risk worth having another Iceberg release for. If you want to upgrade to Avro, you can always override your Avro version in your downstream application, right? It's not like we require or fail if there's a certain version of Avro. So to me, it seems like not worth worrying about from our perspective. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, cool.
the only thing, Ryan, maybe something that we can, not for specifically for this release, but maybe for later, is to add new, maybe Iceberg configuration just to define the max size for an Avro string, something like that, just to pass, from the Iceberg configuration to Avro properties.
I I don't know how much that matters. To be honest, like this is something that is everywhere.
Yeah, it also applies to the other formats too, doesn't it? Like we don't
exactly.
have K, we don't have checks for orc.
Yeah.
Like none of them have. So like this is kind of plugging a hole. But we've got a bunch of other cases where this same exact thing could happen. And again, it's like you're going to run out of memory in a number of different ways. Like it's not only just like string length. You can have, the decompressed size in a number of different situations where it's like the combined columns or combined rows that are being inflated. So I don't see that like this is necessarily fixing anything that isn't just a general issue.
Okay, fair
Yeah.
enough. I agree. Thanks. Yeah, no worries for me. So
Yeah,
it's what I mean. Again, I took a deeper look yesterday, and I share your point. Don't think it worth to have a 1.4.3 release for that. Being said, yesterday we discussed with Edward about all the fixes that could be included in a 1.4.3 release. So it's not in a rush, but probably could be great to have a release maybe next week or in a couple of weeks. That includes all Avro update, just to upgrade, but also more of the other a couple of other issues we discussed with Edward yesterday.
Yeah, I would much rather hold off on a release until we get meaningful bug fixes in.
Yeah, agreed.
So the next one is the merge consistency bug, which is basically it appears that in some cases we are using a overly specific pushdown filter to set the filter that we're using to catch concurrent merge problems. So it appears, and this is my interpretation, it appears that we are using sorry, I'm thinking about what I read from Anton on the issue earlier today, and I think that changes my opinion of what's going on here. We're still tracking down why we're getting overly specific filters, but it looks like in Spark 3.4 and earlier, we get overly specific filters from merge commands that cause us to miss concurrent updates because we're looking for a very specific concurrent update and not a more broad concurrent update. So we're still looking into the fix. I'm going to sync up with Anton hopefully later today about this, and we're still tracking it down. I don't think that this is something that we really need to move all that quickly on. From Anton's comment on 9050, he said that it only occurs when you have constant folding and some very specific cases. He thinks it's a very narrow bug. We will still want to work on tracking this down, but it doesn't seem to be something that has affected users or anything like that. So we're gonna, I think, until we discover that it is more widespread, not like rush and get this out over the holiday. So we are looking into that, and I think Java 1.4 would probably, or the 1.4.3 release, we'd probably want to get a fix for that out unless there's something more urgent, and it looks like the Avro one is not urgent. So if everyone's cool, then we'll go with that plan for the 1.4.3. Okay. I also wanted to. I see a lot of PRs going in, upgrading versions of dependencies and things like that. And I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about how and when we should update dependencies. Just to make sure that we're not just merging a whole bunch of Dependabot things because Dependabot says it's there and the tests pass. So my take here is we should never make a major dependency upgrade unless that dependency is fully shaded and definitely going to be reliable. We should also be careful about minor and patched version updates. I think we should generally make major version upgrades in our major versions, minor version upgrades in our minor versions, and patch updates in our patch versions, right? to basically make sure that we are sticking with SemVer, the SemVer guarantees that we give in our dependencies as well. So we don't make changes, breaking changes to dependencies and APIs. I think that's a good rule of thumb, but we do need to watch for projects like Orc that have made breaking changes in their patch releases. Dan?
Yeah, I think the only consideration that I would add to that is around like CVEs and vulnerabilities that people are tracking. And I'm not sure if there's anything we can configure on Dependabot where we can actually limit how noisy it is. If there is an option to say, hey, only propose updates if there are CVEs attached to the current version, I think that would be a much better situation, because then we're only really looking at things where there is a motivation to move, and it isn't just we're bumping because there's a new number out there.
It seems like we're bumping because there's a new number out there in a lot of cases. So I think we do have the hard limitation of like not breaking our API or transitive APIs. I think everyone's probably in agreement there. I don't hear a ton of like pushback on that. Then that does raise your larger question of when should we upgrade dependencies? Should we do it when we have to, when we need to, or what? Because I know that this can cause a lot of downstream headache if like we start depending on something new and your project is on an older version. Like, it is way easier if your libraries can be upgraded rather than if your libraries need to be downgraded.
And do we have any, Edward might know this better, but do we have any dependencies where we're specifically pinning to like a version that's being used by Spark or by, some other thing that we're depending on, or do we largely just avoid that through shading?
So Arrow and Net are the two.
Yeah, like there are some where I'm very cautious about upgrading, like Netty, and I don't know, some others where I don't know if we're pinning, but like I'm very cautious about upgrading those.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I don't even know whether, I was just checking like whether we can configure Dependabot to not just raise when there's a new update, but only when there's like a, how do you define a significant update?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't think it's that smart.
I don't think there's anything in release metadata that says, hey, this is, a CVE related release.
But there, I see that there's a config that you can configure kind of like, what kind of groups you allow Dependabot to suggest or to fetch updates for. So maybe we can play with that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, what is our Dependabot capabilities aside, right? We can always have a human go and look at the Dependabot stuff and say, this is or is not something that we should care about. I think that the case for like always merging the patch release stuff does make sense, right? Because those are just fixing internal bugs. So I think we shouldn't be scared about patch release upgrades. The API changes or additions, we probably don't want to like depend on those and be too far ahead and have people break if they are dependent on earlier versions. That's my main concern about like when should we upgrade. I think that it's pretty reasonable to have a batch of upgrades on things that we don't think are going to conflict, or anything that we have just shaded. That would be fine. JB?
Yeah, I agree. My only comment is about the CVE, which is, I mean, we know that a lot of scanner, we're gonna have a lot of, on Apache project, we have a lot of requests on the main list, just people asking for updates because they are CVE and they want to get the new dependency upgrade with that. So I agree, minor release should be okay, minor versions, but we also have to consider CVE. just in case. I mean,
So
pretty
yeah,
quickly.
CVEs are a different thing, but Dependabot isn't going to help us there. So I
Yeah,
think
sure.
when we have CVEs, we should look at them and decide whether or not we're going to upgrade, and in some cases, make a patch release. For other stuff, like it seems like unless there is a reason to roll the minor version forward, I think we should just stick within patch releases. I mean that seems like a reasonable path to me. Any thoughts on that, Edward?
No, I think that's fine. Yep.
So
Okay.
it looks like, it may be worth taking another look at the Dependabot configuration. And Edward, I know you already have, but it looks like they have an option for both like version updates and security updates. And maybe we've actually got it set for version updates instead of security updates. So
Yeah,
there
we're
may,
just running the default, which is updating everything.
yeah. So it looks like there may be an option to do more of just like security kind of reporting. That doesn't, necessarily keep us up to date with some of the downstream dependencies, but I'm guessing you could also do one-off runs, like when we do major version upgrades, to see if we should go through a full dependency check and do any bumps at those times.
Yep.
Yeah,
I'll take a close look.
Yeah.
like we do want to keep up to date, within reason. But as a library, I think our responsibilities are to provide to minimize disruption for downstream projects as much as possible, right? And so where it makes sense for a endpoint, a like runtime library, not library, but like a running project or a service or something like that to keep on top of updates. I don't think that it makes a ton of sense for a library in the same way, because we want to minimize that disruption and leave it to the downstream applications to choose when to upgrade. Okay, I think we're all on the same page there. The next discussion is the ref schema behavior. So this is where we found some oddities in the behavior of writes to branches specifically when schemas have changed. Dan?
Yeah. So the high level of this is around partially the interaction with Spark. I haven't actually tested what other engines are doing, but like anything that's going through the Java library is probably using the snapshot util to kind of extract what is the schema that should be presented or used during any operation against the table. And if you're operating against the main branch, or operating against any specific branch, it is going directly to whatever the latest snapshot was. And that can actually conflict with whatever the current state of the table is. So the table has one global schema definition, even though it tracks all of the different schemas. And if you're operating against a branch, it can actually reflect something that is inconsistent with that top level schema. Because if you alter the schema of the table, the branch will reflect whatever the last snapshot was. This leads to some weird inconsistencies where if you like add a column, you can't add into that branch with that column. You don't see it when you describe it until you actually perform another commit, whether it's an empty commit or you actually add data without providing a value for that new column. And then it just magically updates to whatever the top level table schema is, because the reference in the latest snapshot now matches what is the top level schema. So there's kind of two things to think about here. One is, how do tags work versus how do branches work in terms of refs? And I think the behavior that we had was probably much more in line with the thinking around tags, where if you tag a data set, you want to have that same schema, the same data, as long as that tag is around before it expires or something like that. So if you go back and run a query against it, your query doesn't fail because, hey, somebody actually dropped a column and it's no longer visible at the top level schema, but it was visible at the time of that tag. So I think this behavior makes sense for tags because you want to preserve what that schema was so you can continue to use queries that you were using against that tag data set. But for branches, I think we always want to reflect the top level schema. So Edward has a PR to go and fix that behavior. Is there anything you want to add to that, Edward?
There's nothing special in there other than that it's doing what you just described.
Yeah. The other alternatives that we can always consider in the future is like, do we want to introduce more schema tracking by branch? That introduces a whole lot of complexity in terms of behaviors and what happens, if you have multiple competing commits, and if you want to cherry pick from branches, things like that, or if schema evolution happens differently across different branches. So this seems like the most straightforward and supports all of the behaviors that currently exist. So you can't really get into a situation where like got two different branches pointing to do two different schemas, and you add the same column name and they did get the same or different column IDs, and that could have impact on what gets projected as you cherry pick and do other things across those branches. So unless there's any objection, I think we'll go through the review of the PR and everything, but that's kind of the high level of what we found with just the schema behavior and refs. Anything you want to add there, Ryan, or any?
Yeah, I think that this is correct. Branches should have the current schema, just like main has the current schema, instead of pinning to the schema that was last used to commit to the branch, or else any schema change after some commit results in odd behavior. So I think that this is largely correct. Not largely correct. This is correct for the current behavior where the entire table, including all branches, has a specific schema. We may want to consider that last point for V3, which is, do we want to tackle challenges where I want branches to be able to have different schemas? That seems like something we may want, although there are easy workarounds for it, right? So the thing that comes to mind is like if you wanted to have a CC changelog table and a normal table in the same, and the mirror in the same table, right? Granted, these are completely divergent branches, and maybe you should just use separate tables if you need separate schemas. There are some of those questions, but once we get into branching, having separate schemas, we get a lot of odd behavior. So things like, what happens if I add column X to main and column X to my test branch? Do they get the same ID? And like, are those separate columns because I added them to separate branches? What happens if I try to fast forward? Like there are some really weird things that happen if you start having diverging schema changes within a single table. And so I think we either need to think those through very, very clearly, or go with current model, which is a table has a single schema that is the current schema across all branches.
And I would actually say that that may be something that we would want to look into possibly after a V2 release, where we potentially remove some of the existing like fallback behaviors, which could also really complicate how we think about schema evolution across branches, in addition to like the mapping, the name mapping file, and like how does that apply across branches if you've got existing or legacy data. So there are a lot of things to consider, and I think that we probably want to have a clear use case and really define those, and make sure that we don't have any behaviors that are like implicit behaviors that overly complicate it.
Yeah. So I'm also curious, and JB, you might not know, but how does Nessie handle this problem? Because my understanding is that Nessie, uses the metadata files to manage branches, and so there would be essentially no problem with modifying the schema across branches.
Yeah, I think that it's consolidated in the metadata file. So I don't think that. I think Nessie is directly using this. I'm not a Nessie expert, but Nessie is relying a lot on metadata, so should be okay if we update the schema across branches as soon as the metadata is up to date. That's my gut feeling.
I mean, the problem wouldn't that be that I could add column X in the main branch and column Y in in a different branch, and those would get the same ID because they're based on the same upstream metadata file?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the same idea, potentially.
Okay, so that would be I guess, not like a solution, but just more problems.
Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, like, you need that last assigned ID to be applied across all branches at a minimum, which I think we can actually do because that's a table metadata thing. But the question is, like, when to reuse an existing ID because it's in a different branch, right? If I create X in main and create X in branch test, are those separate columns or are they the same column? I mean, we could easily make a choice and say, like, they are the same column if it exists in any current ref.
I'm not sure we're gonna solve this here. Can I bring it back to like a more practical question and problem? Edward, you may have run into this as you were working through the PR, but the other consideration is, what is the behavior with time travel? So if somebody is reading from a branch as of time, are we using the schema from the top level table, or are we using the snapshot schema of the one that was identified? Do you know?
With the changes right now, if you read from the, I mean, like, independently from the SQL, but like if you read from that branch, you're using the schema of the table, which means that if you created the branch at a certain time where two columns existed, and then you drop one column from main and you reread the data, you will not see data for the other column anymore. Which
what about as of time? So like reading from is it that, like, hey, if you're ever using from a branch or ever reading,
as of time should do the right thing.
As of time does not exist for branches.
Yeah, it's just snapshot.
Because we only have the branch history for main. So that uses the history log in the table to find out what main was at that time. So we don't keep that for any other branch. So
that's right.
This is probably something that we should make sure we have a test for, but as of time on a like default.t.branch b1 should fail and say you can't use as of time on a branch table.
Wouldn't you be able to, like, if you use a branch, you look at the current snapshot of the branch and walk the ancestry to as of time?
Can't do that. Can't do that. That would mean that branches have different behavior. So if I said as of time X or as of time T versus as of time branch main T, then I would get different behavior. So we don't want to do that, I think. So we should, Edward, can you also take that on and make sure that we fail?
Yeah, I'll
time travel by timestamp in a branch?
Because we actually don't fail currently. And
I would be surprised if we failed currently.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are edge cases. I think that the overall behavior should be, if you read a branch ref, you get the current table schema. Whether you're using as a version, branch name, or default.t.branch underscore branch name. If you are reading a specific version, as in like this specific snapshot, you should get whatever that snapshot was. And if you're reading a tag, you should get whatever the tag was. I think that is pretty straightforward behavior.
Yeah, I think that this issue was actually introduced as we tried to implement that for tags. And I think that this was what ended up happening, is that we started using this everywhere.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Okay. Unless there are other discussion points, I think that's pretty much it. Most people are out today anyway, so have a wonderful day, especially if it's already the end of the day.